It's 2:17 in the morning, and the tower's dead quiet. You've been on shift for 6 hours. Your coffee went cold an hour ago. Outside, the runway lights stretch into nothing, and the jungle starts where the tarmac ends. Then, your radio crackles. No call sign, no flight number, just a voice that says 7 words. And the worst part isn't what he threatens next. But we'll get to that. Because this isn't the first time he's called. You didn't grow up dreaming about this job. You grew up dreaming about getting out. Out of the neighborhood, out of the cycle, out of the specific kind of poverty that doesn't scream at you. It just whispers quietly every single day that this is all there is. Air traffic control was your way out. 4 years of school, 2 of certification, another year of unpaid apprenticeship at a bigger airport, 2 provinces over, sleeping on a cousin's couch, sending money home when you could spare it. You earned this job, you know that. And for 3 years, it was exactly what you needed it to be. Quiet, stable, boring even. The kind of boring you used to pray for. You managed 24 flights a week, mostly cargo. A few small commercial puddle jumpers. The occasional medical evacuation. Nothing that kept you up at night. But then the airport expanded. The runway got longer. And certain people noticed. In this part of the world, whenever infrastructure improves, 2 groups always show up first. The government cuts the ribbon, and the cartel sends someone to shake your hand. Yours showed up on a Tuesday, and he wore slacks and a collared shirt and bought you lunch at the only restaurant in the terminal. He talked about his kids. He asked about yours. He didn't make any demands that day. He just made sure you knew his name and his number. That was 14 months ago. You've learned things about cartel aviation that nobody outside a tower like this ever thinks about. The cartels moved away from boats a long time ago. Boats are slow, traceable, and the Coast Guard got better. By the early 2000s, aviation became the main method for bulk cocaine transport across the Caribbean corridor and through Central America into Mexico. They used everything. Cessnas stripped of seats and packed floor to ceiling with duffel bags, converted agricultural crop dusters, twin-engine Beechcrafts with modified fuel tanks that could fly 8 hours without stopping, a plane flying below 500 feet, following river valleys, hugging ridgelines, barely registers on civilian radar. You need someone on the ground watching for it, someone who knows when and where to look, who can keep the corridor clear, and who will write quiet shift in the logbook when the night is done. That's the job they wanted from you. The voice on the radio wasn't aggressive. That surprised you. You'd imagined, in the 14 months since the lunch, that when this moment came, it would feel like a confrontation, something cinematic. Instead, it was almost conversational, almost bored. He told you there was a Cessna 210 coming in from the southwest with no flight plan and no transponder. It would cross your airspace in approximately 22 minutes. He needed you to keep the corridor clear and log nothing. But then he said the part that made your hands go cold. He said your daughter's name, not as a threat. That's what made it worse. He said it the way you'd say someone's name to prove you've done your homework, gently, factually. He said, "We know you're a good father." 22 minutes. You think about the controller before you, a man named Hector, who'd worked this tower for 11 years. According to the one person willing to talk about it, Hector said no. Hector retired early, moved away. Nobody's heard from him since. 18 minutes. And sitting there, that there's no version of this call where you walk away the same person who answered it. The movies skip this part. They show you the threat and then the decision. A cut, a close-up, and then the consequences. What they don't show you is the 17 minutes in between where you're just a person sitting in a room trying to figure out what you actually are. You think about calling the authorities, and then you think about what that looks like in practice. In this country, in this region, at this time. You think about the judge who was shot outside a restaurant in broad daylight 2 years ago for accepting a bribery case. You think about the federal officer who tried to intercept a shipment and whose family received a package the following week. You're not naive. You went into this job clear-eyed about the world you lived in. You knew this region, these routes, and on some level you knew for 14 months that this conversation was always coming. Knowing something is possible and living inside the moment it becomes real are two entirely different things. You run the scenario. If you do nothing, and the plane crosses your airspace, lands on an unofficial strip 40 kilometers east, and by dawn, the product is in trucks heading north. The cartel gets paid. The man on the phone goes home. And nobody, not one person who isn't already inside this world, ever knows you were here tonight. There are two legitimate aircraft in your zone right now. A cargo prop hauling agricultural equipment, grounded until 5 a.m., a medical transport that diverted south 2 hours ago and is now outside your range. Nobody is in the air above you. Nobody would be in danger from one more plane passing through the dark. And you understand, in a way that makes you feel sick, that he knew all of that before he called. They always know the schedule before they call. You think about what you'd tell your daughter someday if she ever asked. You think about the version of this where you said no, where you were brave, where it worked out. You think about Hector. You pick up the radio. What you say isn't yes. It isn't no either. It's a question. There's a silence on the other end, long enough for you to wonder if he hung up. Then, just tonight. That's a lie. You know it the way you know the radar sweep will return in exactly 12 seconds. Just tonight is the first rung of a ladder that only goes one direction. But you also know this. You are not a hero. You never were. You're a man who fixed his collar in the mirror this morning and drove to work and poured bad coffee and watched the clock. And in 10 minutes, you're going to make a choice that will follow you for the rest of your life. But what happens on the other side of that choice is something nobody tells you about until it's already done. You make the call. You don't say anything on the radio. You just don't log the contact. You watch the blip cross the southern edge of your zone, track it through the center, watch it fade into the eastern side and off your screen. It takes 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which you breathe and the radar sweeps and the coffee sits cold on the desk. And somewhere above a sleeping jungle, a Cessna 210 with no registration, no transponder, and a cargo worth more than you'll earn in 20 years passes silently through the dark. You don't know who's on that plane. A pilot, probably a co-pilot, maybe a guard. People who made their own version of this choice, or maybe never got one. At 2:41, you open your logbook. Shows you write, no traffic, quiet shift. What you don't know yet, but will piece together over the following weeks, is the scale of what you just let through. That route was part of what DEA analysts later called the Pacific Funnel, a corridor used by Gulf cartel-affiliated networks to move multi-hundred-kilogram shipments from South American production zones into Mexico. At its peak in the mid-2000s, the corridor moved an estimated 35 to 40 tons of cocaine per year. Not all of it moved through your airport, but some of it did. And after that night, more would. Because just tonight lasted 16 months. 16 months, 19 separate flights. Sometimes 2 a month, sometimes nothing for 6 weeks. Long enough that you'd start breathing again and tell yourself maybe it was over. Then the radio would crackle, and you'd do it again. Yeah, you never took money. That matters to you, and you know it probably shouldn't matter as much as it does. You told yourself it was different without the money, that there was a version of this where you were a victim, not a participant. They left one in your locker once. Thick. No note. You put it in the trash. You don't know why that made you feel better. It didn't change anything about the radar. But you're about to find out whether any of it changes what's coming for you. The DEA showed up on a Wednesday. They were investigating a crash site 40 kilometers east of your airport, where a Cessna had gone down in bad weather 3 months earlier. Routine recovery, they said, except the cargo hadn't all burned. You heard about it from a colleague who heard it from the airport manager, who heard it from the ground crew. When you realize you might get caught, it doesn't feel like fear, not exactly. It feels like the floor has always been an illusion, and you've just now looked down. 2 weeks later, the voice on the radio went quiet. No call, no envelope, no contact. Another week passed. You started sleeping again. You started telling yourself the story, where this ended here. where you got away with it, where the 16 months were a nightmare you were waking up from. Then, the DEA came back. This time, they asked for the logbooks. Not your logbooks specifically, all the logbooks. Routine audit, they said. Correlation with known trafficking windows identified through signals intelligence. They do this. They already know what they're looking for before they ask. They just need to see if the paper matches the sky. Now that you sat in that chair and thought about every entry. No traffic. Quiet shift. No contact. 19 times. 19 entries that were technically true and fundamentally lies. They asked if there was anything you wanted to tell them. The real moment isn't 2:17 a.m. in the tower. It's this one. A room with bad lighting, a folder on the desk, and two people watching your face for the tell. Because sitting there, you understand something that 16 months of just once had kept you from understanding. There was never a version of this where you were just a victim. The moment you watched that blip cross your zone and wrote quiet shift, you became something specific. Not a monster and not a hero who flinched, but something messier and more ordinary than either of those things. You became complicit. And the headline version of this story doesn't tell you everything. It skips the 140 families who lost someone to the product that moved through airports like yours. It skips the other controllers at other airports who faced the same call and said no, and what happened to some of them. And it skips the controller who, in a separate documented case in Mexico, said no for 18 months and then finally said yes, then reported himself to authorities and became a key witness. He spent the next 6 years in protective custody, separated from his family, to give testimony that resulted in 11 cartel convictions. In his deposition, he said he still wasn't sure he made the right call. Any of the calls. That's the part that stays with you. Not the DEA interview, not what came after. But the fact that even the man who ultimately did the right thing couldn't tell you with certainty that there was a right thing. Some situations aren't built to have clean answers. They're built to take a person and apply enough pressure in exactly the right places until that person learns something about themselves they can never unknow. What would you have done? The cases behind this story are documented. The pressure that controllers, customs officers, and low-level government workers faced in cartel-heavy regions during the peak trafficking years. The coercion, the threats delivered quietly over lunch, the envelopes in lockers, all of it is in the record. And in almost every case, the people who eventually got caught said the same thing. They thought it would be just once. If that kind of story is what you came for, there's one on screen right now that goes even deeper. Click it. You'll want to see where it goes.